Some men spend their whole lives trying to earn a seat at a table that was never going to be set for them. I spent mine building the table, the chairs, the room the table sits in, and the company that supplies the lumber. And I did it quietly enough that the man sitting at the head of that table never once thought to ask who owned the building he was sitting in. My name is Raymond Aldrich. I am 66 years old. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, on a street called Sycamore Trace, in a house I have owned outright since 1997. It is a good house, 3 bedrooms, a covered back porch, a garage. I use more than the living room. My neighbors know me as the man who shovels their walks in February without being asked and who grows tomatoes that he leaves in paper bags on porches in August. I have one neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn Marsh, who has been leaving a plate of oatmeal cookies on my steps every Thanksgiving for 11 years in exchange for those tomatoes, and I consider this the most equitable business arrangement of my adult life. That is what they know about me. That is enough. I spent 34 years building a manufacturing supply company called Aldrich Industrial out of a 2,800 square foot warehouse on Kemper Road in the Norwood neighborhood of Cincinnati. I started it with a single contract of machine steel fittings, a used Clark forklift I bought at auction for $4,000, and the working knowledge that if you showed up earlier than everyone else and left later and made fewer promises than you kept, the work would compound quietly over time in ways that loud work never does. It did. By the time I stepped into a silent advisory role in the spring of 2019, Aldrich Industrial had 14 full-time employees I would trust with anything, 3 regional distribution contracts with manufacturers in the tri-state area, and 1 very specific long-term supply agreement with a company called Hargrove Consolidated that represented, on average, 41% of Hargrove's total raw materials cost per quarter. I am not telling you that to impress you. I am telling you that so you understand what was already in place. Quietly, legally, completely in place. On the evening of October 14th, 2023, when Gerald Hargrove looked across his own dining room table and told my son that his bloodline was not the caliber they had hoped for. I want to tell you about my son first, because this is really his story, and I have only ever been a supporting character in it. His name is Daniel Aldrich. He is 37 years old. And he is the kind of man who notices what needs doing without waiting to be asked. He fixes things. He shows up. He has a particular quality that I have watched in him since he was small, which is that when a situation is difficult, he becomes quieter and more precise, not louder, and that quality, which his mother Carol had in exactly the same measure, is a thing that has made him genuinely good at every job he has ever held. Carol passed in August of 2016. Which is a thing that reshaped the architecture of everything for both of us, and there is not a day that goes by on Sycamore Trace that I do not think about her in some form. But that is its own story, and this is not that one. Daniel married a woman named Claire Hargrove 9 years ago. They met at a friend's birthday dinner on a Thursday night in March, and from what Daniel told me afterward, they talked until the restaurant closed and then stood outside on 5th Street in the cold for another hour because neither of them was ready to stop. I liked Claire from the first time I met her. She is warm and honest and has a dry, quick humor that she deploys sparingly and well, and she has spent most of her adult life, from what I can observe, quietly managing the emotional weather system generated by the family she was born into. She loves Daniel. He loves her completely. That love and the marriage built on it was the reason I had spent 9 years keeping 2 sets of relationships, professional and personal, separated by a wall I maintained carefully and silently and at some cost to myself. Gerald Hargrove is 69 years old. He inherited a small auto parts distribution operation from his father in 1984 and built it through genuine effort and reasonable intelligence and the specific social gifts of man who is very good at making people feel important, into a regional mid-sized manufacturing supply company with about 60 employees and somewhere north of $12 million in annual revenue. He is proud of this, and the pride is not entirely unearned. He built something real. The problem with Gerald is not that he built something. The problem is that he believes building something once, 30 years ago, tells you everything you need to know about who deserves what now. He drives a 2022 Mercedes GLE. He has his name on a wing of a building at the University of Cincinnati that cost him $400,000, and which he mentions at approximately every third social occasion, sometimes as an aside, and sometimes as the main point, but always a way that lands in the room like a thing that was placed there on purpose. He shakes hands with both hands and holds the grip a half-second longer than is comfortable. He uses the word caliber the way some men use it, as a sorting mechanism, not a description. I had driven a 2008 Toyota Corolla to every one of Gerald Hargrove's dinner parties. It has 211,000 miles on it. The air conditioning works intermittently, and the passenger side window requires a specific two-handed technique to close completely, a technique I have explained to every person who has ever ridden in that car, and which none of them have ever remembered. I bought it used in 2011. I have no plans to replace it. Gerald had mentioned the car 3 times in 9 years, always lightly, always with the specific warmth of a man who considers himself gracious for not saying more. The 3rd time, 2 years ago at Easter, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Raymond, you know we'd be happy to connect you with the dealership we use. Family discount." He said family the way he said burgundy, as a word that was doing more than one job at once. I thanked him. I said the car suited me fine. He nodded in the way people nod when they have placed you in a category, and the category is confirmed. I want to tell you about Russell Briggs, because he is important. Russell is 58 years old, a big, straight-talking man from Dayton, Ohio, with a gray mustache and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who has managed operational chaos for long enough that nothing speeds him up anymore. He had been Hargrove Consolidated's Director of Operations for 19 years, which meant that he was, in the actual day-to-day functioning of the company, the person who kept the machinery running while Gerald attended networking lunches and named buildings after himself. Russell was the man I dealt with at quarterly supply meetings. Gerald had always been too busy to attend those meetings himself, which I had noted without comment for 31 years. Russell and I had coffee at Panera on Kenwood Road 6 or 7 times a year. Not social coffee, working coffee, material schedules and delivery windows, and the particular logistical problems that arise when 2 companies have been operating in close coordination for 3 decades and know each other's systems better than their own. What Russell did not know during those meetings was that he was not talking to a vendor's representative. He was talking to the owner. I had allowed that ambiguity to persist because it was professionally cleaner and personally simpler, and because I had learned a long time ago that the most useful position in any situation is the one people underestimate. In March of 2023, 7 months before the dinner on Shiloh Springs Road, Russell and I were having coffee at the Kenwood Panera after a quarterly review when he said something that I had been waiting, in one form or another, to hear for several years. He said, "Between you and me, if Gerald passes Daniel over for VP, it's going to cost him, not immediately, but operationally, over 2 years. The compounding effect of having someone in that role who doesn't understand the floor is going to show up in ways that are hard to trace back to the decision." That's my read. I said, "Has Gerald indicated he's considering someone else?" Russell said, "Howard has a friend. Young guy. MBA. Gerald likes the optics." I said, "What does the young guy know about operations?" Russell said, "He knows what an MBA teaches you, which is a different thing." I set my coffee down. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, Russell. That's useful to know." He looked at me the way he sometimes looked at me, like a man who was not sure what category I fit in, but who had decided, over many cups of coffee, that I was worth listening to carefully. I drove home on the 71 in my Corolla with the window cracked and thought about what I was going to do with that information. The answer, at that point, was nothing, because the situation had not yet reached the threshold where action was warranted. I am a patient man. I have found that most situations have not yet reached their threshold when people act on them. The ones who wait, who let the situation develop fully before they move, are the ones who move once and don't have to move again. The dinner was on Saturday, October 14th, 6 o'clock. Gerald's house on Shiloh Springs Road is a large colonial with a circular driveway, a kitchen that has been renovated twice since Daniel and Claire married, and a dining room with a mahogany table that seats 12 and which Gerald uses for 8 because he likes the extra space at the ends. Patricia Hargrove is a genuinely good cook and an organized hostess, and the table that evening had flowers and cloth napkins, and Gerald's burgundy opened a brief 40 minutes before the meal, which is the kind of detail you get from a man who has read the right magazine articles. There were 8 of us, Gerald and Patricia at the ends, Claire and Daniel on one side, Gerald's brother Howard, and Howard's wife Diane across from them, me, and an empty chair beside me where Carol would have sat, which is an absence I have stopped trying not to feel and have started simply making room for instead. The meal was good. I said so to Patricia, and meant it. The conversation moved through the usual channels: Howard's golf, Diane's renovation project, a piece of news about someone's colleague that I did not have context for and did not need. Daniel talked about a logistics problem they had solved on the floor the previous week, and I watched Gerald listen to this with the half attention of a man who has already made a decision and is not particularly interested in information that might complicate it. Gerald waited until the plates were being cleared. He said it the way he said everything important, warmly, carefully, from a position of absolute certainty that the room would receive it the way he intended. He said he had been thinking carefully about the VP of Operations position. He said the company was at a critical growth inflection point, and he needed to make sure the leadership structure reflected where Hargrove Consolidated was going, not just where it had been. He turned to Daniel and said, with genuine warmth, that Daniel was the operational backbone of the company, that his contributions were invaluable, and that this decision came from a place of deep respect for everything Daniel had built over 6 years. Then, he said the position was going to Bradley Weston. He said Bradley was 32, held an MBA from Vanderbilt, and brought a strategic perspective that Gerald felt the company needed at this stage of its development. Bradley Weston had been at Hargrove Consolidated for 14 months. Daniel nodded. He said he understood. His face did not change. I watched him hold himself steady in the way I have watched him hold himself steady his whole life, and something in me went cold and still and precise. Not the cold of anger, not the cold of surprise, but the cold of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has just been handed the specific and final confirmation that the patience was correct and that the moment to act was now. Then Gerald looked at me. He did not say it cruelly. I want to be fair about that. He said it in the voice of a man delivering a truth he considers self-evident to a person he is certain cannot challenge it. He said, "Raymond, I hope you know this isn't personal. We just need leadership with the right foundation going forward, the right caliber. I'm sure you understand." He held my eyes just long enough to make sure the message had been received. I said, "Of course." I picked up my water glass. I drank from it. I set it back down. The conversation moved on. Gerald poured more burgundy. Howard made a joke about Bradley's alma mater. Patricia brought out dessert. I ate the dessert. It was good. I told Patricia so. I drove home at 8:47 p.m. The Corolla's heater was working well that night, which I appreciated because October in Cincinnati is a particular damp cold that settles in around 8 o'clock and does not leave until morning. I drove the whole way in silence. No radio. Just the highway and the particular quality of thinking that happens when there is nothing competing with it. I thought about Section 7, Paragraph C of the Hargrove Supply Agreement, which I had last read carefully in January 2021, and which I had thought about, in a general and unurgent way, perhaps a dozen times since then. I thought about what Margaret O'Say would say when I called her. I thought about Russell Briggs and the conversation in March, and the specific phrase he had used, the compounding effect. I got home at 9:11 p.m. I parked in the garage and sat in the Corolla for a moment with the engine off in the dark, and I let myself feel the full weight of what happened at that table. Not the insult to me. I had absorbed those for 9 years, and they had never touched anything that mattered. The weight of Daniel's face when Gerald said Bradley Weston's name. The specific quality of his nod. That was the thing that I held in the dark garage on Sycamore Trace for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I counted. Then I went inside. I made coffee. Black. No sugar. The same way my father made it. And the same way I have made it every morning and most evenings of my adult life. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop and pulled up the Hargrove Consolidated Supply Agreement, which I keep in a folder labeled with the contract year, and which I have not needed to search for in 31 years, because I have always known exactly where it was. I read Section 7, Paragraph C, at 9:34 p.m. Then I read it again, at 9:52 p.m. I called Russell Briggs. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Russell, it's Raymond Aldrich." I'm sorry to call on a Saturday evening. He said not to worry about it, his voice carrying the easy patience of a man who does not mind being called. I told him I wanted to have coffee on Monday, if he had time. He said he had time. I said, bring your calendar. There was a brief pause on the line, and then he said he would. I set the phone down. The coffee had gone cold while I was reading. I poured it out and made a fresh pot I did not need, and I sat at the table while the kitchen settled into the specific quiet of a house where one person has been living alone for 7 years, and I let the plan come together the way plans do when you are patient enough to let them arrive on their own. I want to be honest with you about the weekend. People want the story of a man who spent 2 days in cold fury, sharpening his plan the way you sharpen a blade. That is a good story. It is not mine. I sat on the back porch on Sunday morning with coffee and watched the October light come to the oak tree at the back of the yard. The one Carol planted the spring we moved in. A small thing then that is now taller than the roof, and which loses its leaves in particular slow gold sequence every October that I have watched for 26 years. I thought about Daniel. I thought about Carol, who would have known exactly what to do and would have done it 3 days earlier and more elegantly than I was going to do it. I thought about the word caliber and the specific way Gerald had used it, not as an assessment, but as a placement, a hand on a shoulder pushing someone gently but firmly into the category that suited the speaker. I gave myself the morning. I drank the coffee. I watched the oak tree. Then I went inside, made lunch, a turkey sandwich on the good bread from the bakery on Madison Road. And I opened my legal files and got to work. Russell arrived at the Panera on Kenwood Road at 8:03 a.m. on Monday. He ordered his own coffee, which he always did, and sat down across from me with his calendar open on the table, which told me he had thought about the call on Saturday night and had decided this was going to be a different kind of meeting. He is a perceptive man, Russell. I said, how long have you been with Hargrove Consolidated? He said, 19 years in February. I said, and in those 19 years, have you ever had reason to wonder who actually owns the supply companies you work with at the senior level? He looked at me steadily. He said, occasionally. I said, what do you know about Aldrich Industrial, the actual ownership structure? There was a pause, not a long one. Russell Briggs was not a man who took long pauses. He said, I've always dealt with your operations manager, Sandra. I said, you have? That was by design. Another pause. He said, are you the owner? I said I was. I said I had been since 1988, when I incorporated the company with a single contract and a used forklift, and that the reason he had always dealt with Sandra was because I had made a deliberate decision when my son married into the Hargrove family to keep professional and personal relationships cleanly separated. I said I had maintained that separation for 9 years because it was the right thing to do and because I had not wanted Daniel's position at Hargrove Consolidated to be complicated by the knowledge of what his father owned. Russell sat with that for a moment. He picked up his coffee and set it down without drinking. He said, and now? I said, I would like your honest operational read on what Saturday's dinner means to the company, not the politics, the operations. He looked out the window at the Kenwood parking lot for a moment. Then he looked back at me and said, Daniel should have gotten that promotion. Bradley Wesson is smart, and he works hard, and in 4 years he might be excellent. He is not excellent now. The learning curve in that role, in a company with Hargrove's dependency on supplier relationships, is 12 to 18 months. During those 12 to 18 months, things will slip, not dramatically, incrementally. The kind of slipping that doesn't show up on a quarterly report, but shows up in a production floor in ways that are hard to diagnose. I said, thank you. He said, what are you going to do? I said I was going to have a conversation with my attorney and then make some decisions. I said I wanted him to know clearly and directly that I was not asking him to act against Gerald or against Hargrove Consolidated, and that nothing we had discussed was anything other than a factual briefing between two people who had been working together in good faith for a long time. Russell said, I understand. I paid for the coffees. I thanked him. I drove back to Sycamore Trace. At 11:15 a.m., I called Margaret Osei. Margaret is 54 years old. She is a partner at Osei and Callaway on Vine Street in downtown Cincinnati, and she has handled every significant contract and business matter for Aldrich Industrial for 22 years. She has a particular quality of a very good attorney. which is that she reads documents the way a surgeon reads a scan, quietly, completely, without any visible interest in the emotional content of what she is reading. And when she finishes and speaks, what she says is accurate and necessary, and nothing else. She has never once, in 22 years, told me what she thought I should feel about a situation. She tells me what is true and what the options are, and then she waits for me to decide. It is the most useful professional relationship I have ever had. I told her about the dinner. I told her about Bradley Weston and the MBA from Vanderbilt and the 14 months. I told her what Russell had said about the operational impact. Then I told her I wanted to know exactly what Section 7, Paragraph C of the current Hargrove Consolidated Supply Agreement permitted in terms of volume adjustment and pricing renegotiation, and under what conditions either party could initiate a formal review. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Raymond, when did you last exercise that clause?" I said, "Never." She said, "In 31 years." I said, "In 31 years." She said, "And you want to exercise it now?" I said I wanted to understand my options fully before I decided anything. She said, "Give me 48 hours. I want to read the 2021 renegotiation language carefully before I tell you anything." I said that was fine. I thanked her. I hung up and made dinner, pasta with a sauce I had been making since 1991, which Carol always said was better than had any right to be coming from a man who claimed not to cook, and I ate at the kitchen table with the news on low in the background, and the oak tree visible through the window, its branches dark against the October evening sky. Margaret called me back on Wednesday, October 18th, at 4:17 p.m. She said the clause was clean and fully enforceable. She said that under the terms of the 2021 renegotiation, Aldrich Industrial had the right to initiate a formal volume and pricing review with 60 days written notice to Hargrove Consolidated's designated contact, and that any new terms proposed during the review window would need to be formally accepted or rejected by Hargrove within 30 days of receipt. She said that if Hargrove rejected the proposed terms or failed to respond within the 30-day window, the existing agreement would convert to month at the previous contract year's pricing with no minimum volume guarantee on either side. I said, "What does the loss of the minimum volume guarantee mean for Hargrove's operations in practical terms?" Margaret said, "Based on the dependency percentage you described, 41% of their raw materials cost. It means that if Aldrich Industrial chose to reduce volume, Hargrove would need to source replacement materials from the spot market at current rates, which are considerably higher than your contract pricing, or from alternative suppliers, most of whom will require a qualification period of 60 to 90 days before Hargrove could rely on them for production commitments." I said, "And if they miss production commitments during that period?" She said, "That is a question for their attorney and their existing customers." I said, "Yes." There was a pause on the line. Margaret said, "Raymond, I have one question before we go further. What is the specific outcome you are trying to achieve? I want to understand it precisely." I said, "I want my son to hold the title of Director of Vendor Relations at Hargrove Consolidated with a formal employment contract, a defined salary, and a seat at every materials and procurement meeting that involves Aldrich Industrial or our affiliated accounts. I want the role to be his because it is the right role for the company and because he is the right person for it, not because his father made a phone call. The structure of what we do needs to make that outcome the obvious business decision, not the sentimental one." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a very specific ask." I said, "I have had 31 years to think about it." She said, "I'll draft a review notice. I'll send you a version for approval before it goes out." Margaret sent me the draft notice on Thursday morning, October 19th at 7:45 a.m. I read it at the kitchen table with my first cup of coffee. It was 2 pages. The language was precise and unhurried and cited Section 7, Paragraph C by name and by page number and by the specific date of the 2021 renegotiation in which it had been affirmed. It specified the 60-day review window and requested a meeting at the earliest mutual convenience of both parties to begin formal discussions. It was addressed to Gerald Hargrove personally, with a copy to Hargrove Consolidated's corporate counsel, a man named Philip Drury, whose name I recognized from the 2021 renegotiation. I approved it at 8:12 a.m. and sent Margaret a one-word reply: "Send." She sent it at 9 a.m. by certified mail and by email, simultaneous delivery. Return receipt requested. At 9:43 a.m., 43 minutes later, Kevin Park, Hargrove Consolidated's operations coordinator, called Aldrich Industrial's main line. Kevin had been with Hargrove for 11 years. He is a competent and careful man, and I have always liked him, which made the next part of the morning somewhat uncomfortable and also, in a particular dry way of things, a little bit funny. Sandra Chu, who has been my operations manager for 14 years and who I had briefed the previous afternoon in a 15-minute conversation that I think she found clarifying in multiple respects, took Kevin's call. She told him, calmly and without elaboration, that all inquiries regarding the volume review were being directed to Aldrich Industrial's legal counsel and gave him Margaret's office number on Vine Street. Kevin called Margaret at 10:07 a.m. Margaret told him what she would have told anyone in that position. She was available to schedule a formal meeting, and all substantive communication should proceed through proper channels. At 11:52 a.m., Gerald Hargrove called my personal cell phone. I did not answer. At 12:14 p.m., he called again. At 12:41 p.m., he left a voicemail. I listened to it twice, standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water. His voice was measured. Gerald was a measured man. It was his most disciplined quality. But underneath the measure was a texture I recognized. Not panic. Not yet. Something earlier than panic. The specific low-frequency note of a man who has just discovered that a floor he has been walking on confidently for 31 years is made of a different material than he assumed. He said, "Raymond, I think there may be a misunderstanding here that I'd very much like to clear up. I'd appreciate the chance to speak with you directly, man to man, before this process goes any further. Give me a call when you get a chance." Man to man. I had thought he might use that phrase. I set my phone on the kitchen table. I looked at it for a moment. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I called Daniel on Thursday evening, after I had spoken with Margaret a second time, and after the day had settled enough that I knew what I was going to say. He answered on the first ring. I could tell from the quality of the silence before he spoke that he already knew something had happened. Either Claire had told him or word had moved through the office in a particular fast, in formal way that operational news always moves before official news does. He said, "Dad, what did you do?" I said, "I sent a notice of volume and pricing review to Hargrove Consolidated under the terms of our current supply agreement." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald called Claire." I said, "I expected he might." He said, "She's upset." I said, "I know. I'd like to talk to you both. Would you come for dinner on Saturday?" There was a long pause. I let it sit. I did not fill it. Daniel said, "Dad, did you own Aldrich Industrial this whole time? The whole 9 years?" I said, "Since 1988. He said, "You never told me." I said, "No." There was another pause, longer. I heard Claire's voice in the background, low and asking something I could not make out. He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because you worked for Gerald, and I did not want you to have to manage the distance between those two facts every day you went to work. I wanted everything you earned at Hargrove to be yours. Earn on your ability and your judgment and your 19-hour days in that building, not on what your father owned. You have done that. Every year you have done that." He did not say anything for a moment. I said, "Come Saturday, I'll make the pot roast." He said, 6 o'clock? I said, 6 o'clock. They came. Daniel came in first and hugged me at the door, which he does not always do, and Claire came in behind him and held on for a long time without saying anything, which told me more than any conversation could have. We ate at the kitchen table. The pot roast, green beans, the dinner rolls from the bakery. The conversation was careful at first, and then less careful, the way conversations go when the food is good and the room is warm, and people who love each other stop performing and start talking. Claire said, at some point during the second hour, "I need you to know I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at him. There's a difference." I said I knew there was. She said, "He has always done this. He decides what something is worth, and then he never revisits it. It doesn't matter what changes." I said, "I know." She said, "Daniel has given that company 6 years." I said, "He has?" And what happens next is going to reflect that. She looked at me across the table for a moment with the specific expression of a person who is trying to decide how much to trust what she is hearing. Then she nodded once and asked if there was more pot roast. There was. The meeting between Aldrich Industrial and Hargrove Consolidated was scheduled for Tuesday, November 7th, at Margaret's offices on Vine Street. It was the earliest date that worked across both legal teams' calendars, which was itself a minor piece of information about the relative urgency being felt on each side. Gerald came with Philip Drury and a second attorney named Carla Wynn, a litigation partner whose presence told me that Gerald had initially framed the situation, in the privacy of his own thinking, as a confrontation rather than a negotiation. I noted that I came with Margaret. Margaret's conference room is on the 14th floor of the Vine Street building. The windows face north over the city, and on the clear November morning of that meeting, you could see past the Ohio River to the Kentucky hills going bronze with late fall color. The table was dark walnut, 8 chairs, water and coffee set out at both ends. Philip Drury poured himself coffee within 30 seconds of sitting down. Carla Wynn had a yellow legal pad and a pen she clicked twice before setting it down. Gerald sat directly across from me and looked, as he always looked, like a man who had dressed carefully and arrived prepared and expected those 2 facts to be sufficient. He said, "Raymond, thank you for making the time." I said, "Of course." He said he wanted to begin, if I didn't mind, by speaking plainly and as family. He said he understood the timing of the review notice might have created an impression he was eager to correct. He said Hargrove Consolidated had always valued the Aldrich relationship, not just commercially but personally, given the connection between our families, and that he was hopeful we could find a path forward that honored 31 years of mutual trust and good faith. He used the word family 3 times in that opening statement. I counted. I let him finish. Margaret let him finish. Then Margaret opened the folder in front of her and, without a word, slid a single document across the walnut table. It was 1 page. 2 terms, cleanly stated. The first was a pricing adjustment, a recalculation of the per-unit materials cost reflecting the actual market rate increases that had occurred since the 2021 renegotiation, which were real and documentable, and which Aldrich Industrial had, until this point, absorbed without passing through to Hargrove. The number was specific. An increase of 11% on base materials, phased over 2 contract years. It was a fair number. Margaret had made sure of that. The second term was a structural condition for any long-term contract renewal. It required Hargrove Consolidated to establish a formal director of vendor relations position with defined responsibilities, a documented salary band, and the authority to attend all procurement and materials planning meetings. It further specified that the individual filling the role would need to be jointly approved by both companies, that Aldrich Industrial would have a confirming vote, and that the role was being created in recognition of the operational complexity of managing a supplier relationship that constituted over 40% of Hargrove's materials cost. Philip Drury read it twice. He looked at Carla Wynn. She looked at the page. Gerald read it. He read it the way people read things they already understand before they have finished reading them, his eyes moving carefully, his face very still, and then stopping at the second term and staying stopped. He looked up at me. I held his eyes and said nothing. I had a glass of water in front of me, and I picked it up and drank from it and set it back down with the specific patience of a man who has been patient for 31 years and has no problem being patient for another 30 seconds. Gerald said, "The Director of Vendor Relations position." I said, "A role that makes operational sense regardless of who fills it. Any company with a single-source supplier relationship at 41% of materials cost should have a dedicated liaison. That is simply good operational structure." He said, "And the joint approval." I said, "We need to be confident the person in that role understands both organizations. That is a reasonable condition for a role of this significance." Carla Wynn said something quietly to Philip Drury. He made a note. Gerald said, "You're talking about Daniel." I said, "I'm describing a role. Daniel meets every qualification I would apply to that role. 6 years of operational experience at Hargrove, deep familiarity with our supply processes, the trust of both teams. If you have other candidates who meet those qualifications equally well, I'm genuinely willing to hear about them." There was a long silence. The kind of silence that has content in it. Gerald said, "You've been our supplier for 31 years. I said, "I have." He said, "And you never once said who you were." I said, "The work spoke for itself. I did not think the identity was relevant." He looked at me across the walnut table with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had finished calculating a long time ago. I watched him arrive at the specific understanding that the person he had been categorizing for 9 years as Claire's harmless, modest, slightly below-the-line father-in-law had been, for those same 9 years, the owner of the company that Hargrove Consolidated could not function without. He said, the caliber comment, at dinner. I said, "You don't need to revisit it here." He said, "Raymond." I said, "Gerald, I am not here for an apology. I am here to discuss contract terms. If there is an apology owed to anyone at this table, it is owed to my son. That conversation is between you and him. This conversation is between our companies." Philip Drury cleared his throat quietly. Gerald sat back in his chair. He looked at the document. He looked at me. He picked up his pen. We spent the next 90 minutes on numbers and timelines and the specific language of the position description. Margaret handled every term with the calm precision of a person who has done this for 22 years and does not need to win points that do not matter. Philip Drury had 3 substantive questions and 2 that were reflex of professional caution, and Margaret answered all 5 of them accurately and without condescension. At 2:41 p.m., Gerald Hargrove initialed the proposed amendment to the supply agreement. His hand was steady. I want to be fair about that. It was steady. I thanked him for his time. We shook hands. He held it the normal length. The final agreement was executed on December 3rd. Margaret handled the drafting in its entirety. Philip Drury submitted 3 proposed revisions, all of which were reasonable and 2 of which were improvements, and Margaret accepted them without friction because the substance had already been settled and because I had told her, when she asked, that I wanted this to be a fair agreement that both companies would want to honor for the next 30 years. The Director of Vendor Relations position was offered to Daniel on December 9th. I was not in the room. I was not on the phone. I did not send any message to Gerald or to anyone at Hargrove Consolidated about the process or the timeline. What Daniel negotiated in that room, his title, his salary, his reporting structure, the scope of his authority, he negotiated himself. When he called me afterward and told me the number, I said it sounded right to me. He said he thought so too. Daniel and Claire came to dinner that Friday. He brought a bottle of wine. He did not mention the vineyard. We ate at the kitchen table. The 4 of us Claire had brought their dog, a large and completely undisciplined golden retriever named Biscuit, who spent most of the meal under the table in a state of hopeful alertness, and the conversation was easy and warm in the way that conversations are when a hard thing has been resolved, and everyone at the table knows it, and no one needs to say so directly. Claire hugged me at the door for a long time when they left. She said, "Thank you, Raymond." I said, "He did it himself." She said, "You know what I mean." I said I did. Gerald called me on December 11th at 9:22 a.m. I answered. He said he wanted me to know he respected the way I had handled things and that he'd been thinking about the dinner and wanted to say, plainly, that the caliber comment was wrong and that he regretted it. I said I heard him. I said I appreciated the call. I said I looked forward to a good working relationship going forward. I meant it. You can respect the process and still mean it. It is May now. Daniel is 7 weeks into the role. Russell told me last Thursday at coffee. The Kenwood Panera, 8:15 a.m., his coffee, my coffee, the same table we have been using for years, that the operations team had noticed a difference in the first 2 weeks. He said there was a particular quality to a liaison who understood both sides of a production relationship from the inside, and that Daniel had that quality, and that it was already showing up in the scheduling meetings in ways that were hard to quantify but easy to feel. I thanked him. I drove home in my Corolla. I patted the dashboard at the stoplight on Kemper Road the way I do, a habit I developed around 2015, and I've never seen a reason to stop. And then I went home and made dinner and called Daniel to see how the week had gone. The tomatoes are in the ground on Sycamore Trace. The oak tree Carol planted is in full leaf, the specific deep green of Cincinnati in May. And in the morning when I sit on the back porch with my first cup of coffee, I can hear the birds moving through it before I can see them. Everything is where it is supposed to be. Not everything I wanted, That would require Carol to be sitting in the porch chair across from me, and some things stay lost. But everything that could be put right has been put right, and that is, in the quiet arithmetic of a life, more than enough. Patience, it turns out, is the only currency that matters in a long game. Anger spends fast and leaves you with nothing. Patience compounds in the dark, quietly, for as long as you are willing to let it. 31 years of fair dealing. One clause on page 7. And a son who walked into that room in December and earned every word his own contract. Some men don't look like what they are. They just are. And the people who never bother to ask, they find out eventually, not with a speech, not with a scene, with a document slid across a walnut table on November morning and the specific silence that follows it.